Thank you all for joining us for the RC West Oversight Committee. My name is Brenda Corona, here representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group at the California ISO, and today I'll be helping facilitate this call with many of my colleagues here from the ISO, as well as our chair, Ben Brandt. Today, we will have a public session from 1 to 2:30, and after this meeting, it will be the executive session, and there's a separate invite for that. At this time, there's a few housekeeping reminders to help facilitate this call smoothly, is that in order for us to provide any questions, please make sure to submit them through chat and add your name of your company as well. You're able to use the raise hand icon when you do have a question, and we advise you to introduce your name and your company that you're representing as well. And if you do experience any technical issues during the meeting, feel free to send them to myself or Yelena or my event producer, Silas, who will be helping today's call. But all materials will be added to the CAISO.com on the RC portal, as well as the RC West Oversight Committee at CAISO.com under Stay Informed and RC West. So for that, we can go ahead and review the agenda for today. Today, we will not have a roll call that we normally do, where we go down the list and ask for verbal company names. So we might just go ahead and ask everyone to submit their chat, at least one person per organization, and we will go ahead and monitor that. We want to make sure we have at least 50% quorum for our voting for the next few agenda items. But we will go over RC West Oversight Business Committee with just Ben today, and then we will do a general operations with Tim Beach. We will have procedure updates with Kathleen Fernandez, and then RC metrics update with Rachel. And then Rachel will kick things off for the working group, for the data exchange working group presentation, and then she'll turn it to Mike Turner. He'll do a network model, a link model scope process change. And then lastly, we'll have Tricia Johnston for the FERC 881 update. And then lastly, we'll wrap things up with any future agenda items, as well as review the calendar for our meetings for the working groups for 2023. And so far, I do see a lot of folks adding on our chat, and I really appreciate that. It gives us an idea of who's here. So far, we do see PUD, we do see Turlock Irrigation District, Pacific Gas and Electric, Portland General Electric, and we do see Bonneville Power Administrator. So keep sending those to us so we can make sure we kind of have a quorum. At this time, I'll go ahead and hand things off to Ben Brandt, our chair.
Thanks, Brenda. All right, our first order of business will be to elect the new Oversight Committee members, the chair and vice chair positions, or to those vice chair and chair positions. We do have a couple of nominations for those positions, so let's go ahead and move to that slide. So Chris Hoffman from SRP, he has served in the vice chair role and has submitted his name to go ahead and step into that chair role as a nomination there. And then Chris Sanford with Bonneville has volunteered to step into that vice chair role. At this time, are there any additional nominations from the floor for the committee chair or committee vice chair positions? And you can unmute and do that, or you could enter it on the chat, however you would like to do that. I'll give everybody a minute and see if we get any additional nominations.
If you'd like to submit a nomination, you could, Ben, I was going to ask if they wanted to raise their hand, but I don't see any on the phone line. Just want to confirm. Silas, do we have anyone on the phone line?
There's no hands raised in the phone line at this time.
Okay, and we haven't received any other nominations via email or other communication. So at this time, we'll go ahead and close the nominations for the chair and vice chair of the RC Oversight Committee. Because both of these positions are currently running unopposed. We do have the option here for somebody to make a motion that we accept these nominations without election and move Chris Hoffman and Chris Sanford into these positions just by a simple motion and vote on that motion. Would anybody make that motion for the committee? Our other option is to vote. So but to vote on each position individually, or okay, Toxie Burris has made a motion that we accept these nominations as running uncontested. Is there a second for that? Looks like Kathy Downey seconded. All right. Are there any opposed to moving that motion forward? Give a moment to see if there's any opposed. All right, seeing none opposed, the motion passes to accept Chris Hoffman and Chris Sanford, their nominations for those committee chairs and to move them into those positions. So appreciate all you folks for letting us move that through efficiently like that, and really appreciate Chris and Chris being willing to serve in those positions for the next coming term. So thank you for that. Our next order of business is to talk about some edits to the charter. In front of you is a summary there. For the most part, there's just some cleanup around some naming, but there are a couple where or at least one where there's an actual change to the language itself for clarification or to clean up something that looked like maybe a conflict. Okay, so it looks like we had a chat come up regarding being unable to unmute on the phone. Did you see that, Brenda? Let me see
Yes.
if it was.
Michael would need to press pound too, if he can.
Then we need to verify with Michael if there was any concern or if he was, since he was unable to vote, if he, on that motion, if he was potentially opposed. If he was, we might have to go back, but, or at least count that opposition. But it doesn't look like that's the case. So we'll continue on with the charter edits. So we do have examples of those edits. Okay, hey, thanks, Michael, appreciate that. We'll go to the next slide, which shows the actual revisions. I suppose, you can zoom in on those if you want. So let's talk about the first one there. I believe this was submitted by Toxie Burris, and it just cleans up what appeared to be a conflict. I'm not going to address all the name changes from CAISO RC to RC West. I think that probably makes sense to everybody, unless somebody wants to review those. But you see there, the last sentence does not was added in for clarification, and the sentence just didn't read maybe as well as it could have, and maybe even looked like it had a conflict. Does anybody have any concern with that change? Or is there any opposition to that change? Okay, let's move on down or move to the next more significant change, and we'll review that one. Everybody take a look at that. Again, mostly what you see here is the CAISO RC to RC West. However, in the upper left-hand corner, you do see a change there. So you likely can hit Zoom. I see that Dave has mentioned they're hard to read. I was struggling with that myself. and I hit Zoom, I can read that out loud if we like, or maybe if the Zoom works for you. Okay. Thanks, Dave. Are there any concerns with the language change that was submitted regarding the reviews? Such reviews may occur no more frequently than once every 3 years. Well, oh, that's helpful. Thank you.
I don't see any questions in queue, Ben.
Okay, and then I guess we can just go to the last page there so we can get see the other change. Well, that's, yeah, there we go. Thank you. Oh, no, maybe it would be when we had them both side by side, there was one other page with changes, I think, just so everybody can see that they're all name changes, I guess.
Okay, 1 second.
Okay, there you go. And you can see that those others, again, are that change from CAISO RC to RC West. So now that we've reviewed the changes, do I have a motion to accept the changes as reviewed in the meeting today? Chris Sanford motions to accept. Do I have a second? And Michael Court seconds. Is there any opposition to accepting, any opposition to the motion to accept these changes?
I think John from SCE wanted to second it, but he's good. I think he dropped his hand.
Oh, okay, I was just reading the chats, so. I will give it just a little bit more time to see if there is any opposition. Does anyone have any opposition to the motion to accept these changes as reviewed? Okay, not seeing any opposition, the motion passes, and that concludes the business items for the committee. As was mentioned, Chris Hoffman is traveling today, so he's not with us in the meeting. But congratulations to Chris Hoffman and Chris Sanford, and again, thank you for your willingness to step up and fill these positions. I'm going to go ahead and just continue through this portion of the meeting. I'm not going to leave Chris hanging here. We'll, I guess, handle the meeting as we have, and then kind of turn everything over to Chris and Chris at the end, if that's that works for them. Thanks. I think it's back to CAISO and the updates, or RC West, I guess.
Thank you, Ben. We appreciate your help and RC West as well. That's a great kudos to you too for your participation. And let's go ahead and introduce Tim for any words for the RC West.
Okay, thank you, Brenda, and Ken, thank you for your service as chair. Much appreciated, especially given the circumstances we have a lot of these meetings over the webinars versus being in person. So makes the task a little bit more difficult sometimes. So thank you very much for that. Next slide, please. Just a few items to update you with. As we finished out the last quarter, or this fall, we did have a good heat wave. Was in the area from December 1st or September 1st to September 9th. We had 41 EEAs on the year. 32 of those were declared over the heat wave. Many of those EEA 3s and EEA 2s were The EA2s were, many of those were for BAs to get access to power pool resources per the procedure, the power pool procedures, but also the armoring of and dispatch of demand response. The EA3s were largely associated with being full of resource and then designating firm load that qualified for 10-minute qualification for contingency reserves. So pretty busy. During the heat wave, we set some historical peak records. RC West set a record of 130,985 megawatts. Previous record was 127,000 megawatts on August 20th of 2020. And then the WEC historical load, we also set a record there of 167,530 megawatts. What is interesting to note is there's still more load out there. We're very hot in California and the Southwest, and was quite warm in the Northwest. It wasn't the peak temperatures we saw in the Northwest in 2020. So that tells me that there's still more load out there, and we haven't probably found our peak load yet. Whether we'll see that in the future or not remains to be seen, but it's certainly a possibility. Any questions on the EEAs? Okay, thank you. We can go to the next slide then. A few things are happening at the national level that pertains to reliability coordination, but will also be felt at the BA and TOP level. Out of the cold weather recommendations, and this is the genesis of the recommendations, is the Texas event that happened a couple years ago. One of the recommendations is for operators to simulate firm load shed scenarios to include administrating rotating load shed over a long period. Now, this is not something like 2 hours, but if you had to rotate load over a number of days, how would you do that? They want simulations on that. The NERC RTOS has been handled this from the NERC RTSC to address it and to determine how we best should approach this. Right now, the RTOS will be reviewing the NERC alert responses for creating items that address this issue. From that, we may issue a reference paper or guideline to close those training gaps. I imagine, a lot of times we practice firm load shedding in our restoration drills, right? So this may become a component of those drills, is an exercise within the drill to rotate firm load blocks over a given period of time. So that'll be coming, that'll be felt at all TOPs, BAs, and RCs. The next one was another item to address was under frequency load shedding coordination with frequency tripping relays. In particular, frequency tripping relays that aren't generators. So as observed in the Texas event, they had some relays, some generators trip on frequency before the UFS-LS coordination blocks triggered. Normally, you would hope that the UFS block 1 would arrest the frequency decline before you started losing generation and impact the generation grader, right? So there was a review by a couple of working groups. The RTOS is going to look at those reviews. A preliminary review indicates there is some disagreement on how to arrest frequency stalling. It is viewed that some working groups feel that the RC could direct manual load shedding to arrest frequency stall and recover frequency. But the time durations to do that is very short, given the specifications and parameters we've seen so far. So in the neighborhood of 3 minutes for the Western interconnection. So that's, that's not possible. So we really need to take a look at what the recommendations are and the whole parameters around that. We'll be doing that early next year. On there, any questions on those two things as they relate to cold weather? Okay, Another thing, there's the RCIS system, the Reliability Coordinator Information System. The RCs all use that to communicate with each other. In addition to, in the West, we also use GMS, but we use RCS. We can communicate through the whole country that way, and ERC monitors it as well. That was scheduled to be replaced around 2019, 2018. They were launching the project. They decided with all the things that were going on to postpone that project at that time. And now that we've established these RCs, they're readdressing that, and the project will be lifting or starting next year to replace that system. I know some transmission operators also monitor that system as well. We will be looking at potentially having the functionality within that system that an RC can communicate to VAs and TOPs. So there is a chance that we may get down to one messaging system in the future, but that remains to be seen going forward. But that project is launching, and you may hear some more about that eventually. The other thing is coal deliveries in the Eastern Interconnection and the potential railroad strike. So this has been in a topic throughout the year, and most recently we saw that Congress had intervened and settled the potential for a strike. So that concern is relatively mostly removed. There is slight concern about a wildcat strike. That's an unauthorized strike. It's felt that's pretty remote. That probably won't happen, but there's always that potential out there. Or the other thing they're monitoring is, I think as part of their contract, there's a lump sum payment that goes to the union workers post lump sum payout. There could be, you know, a large scale retirement or people quitting or leaving the railroad workforce. So they're monitoring that situation to see what happens there. Without the deliveries, there was very few problems here in the Western Interconnection, but in the Eastern Interconnection it was much greater. They were watching the strike pretty carefully, and if they got to a point where they weren't getting deliveries over a relatively short period of time, they'd have to start managing their inventory, their coal inventory at their plants. As a result, that would put pressure on the natural gas. So, but it looks like that's largely been averted at this point. Any questions on those items? Okay, next slide. I think we're going to procedures. That'd be Kathy.
I don't see Kathy. I think she dropped off. Let's see if we can. Tim, do you know where she's at?
Hey, this is Rachel Melton. I see Kathy on the attendee line, so if she presses #2, maybe she'll be able to unmute.
Can we promote Kathy Silas to panelist, please?
Yes, we've just promoted Kathy to panelist, so she should be able to unmute.
Hello, all. I'm so sorry about that. I thought that I was on the right line. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay. Again, this is Kathy Fernandez. I'm going to give you the procedures update. So first, I have the recently published procedures that have been published over the last month and a half or so. We had RC 130, and that was, we added a footnote to an item regarding momentary outages of equipment less than 300 kV there, and a couple of other minor changes to that one, as well as RC 130A with a minor update. We updated RC 220, 90, 30, and $9,000 for annual review, and a few other minor updates, as well as a few other procedures that are listed here. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but these are the updates. The only one here that's more of a major revision was the RC 610, the SOL methodology, and that actually published with a 10/1 effective date. So you might already have been aware of that one. So this is all that I've got for recently published. Is there any questions regarding recently published?
I don't see any questions. Go ahead.
Okay. I just was going to point out, I apologize, RC 9570 is actually a new RC procedure that was published. The description wasn't clear as I looked at it quickly, but yes, that is a new procedure that we converted from what we call a tool guide. So that is for assistance with SANASE, just because that's more of a different scenario there. But so I will move on to the next slide then, since there's no questions. Okay, and these are upcoming procedure changes. We're winding down at the end of the year, so not really anything major going on. We're going to be publishing RC 120, 120A, and 120B. We've been communicating these changes for a bit now. They were posted for public comment through 12/1, so I'll be taking those down, the draft versions, and publishing those shortly. They do have an effective date of April 1st, but we wanted to give plenty of time for the communication to go out there, because there are some changes regarding the data specification. So that is coming up. And then we've got annual reviews just for RC 600, 600A, and RC 9010. So those will be published within the next couple weeks. RC 9010 will be early to mid-January. And that's really all I've got. Are there any questions regarding upcoming procedure changes? Okay, thank you very much. You can go ahead and go on to the next one, Brenda.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy and Brenda. So for RC metrics, we're going to walk through a few of the Q3 2022 metrics. The year-end metrics for 2022 will be presented out next year. So I'm going to pass it for a couple of slides over to Vera to take it away and walk us through the Q3 results. Oops, Vera, you might be on mute. We can't hear you.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Vera. As Rachel mentioned, thank you, Rachel. It will be the Q3 report. Am I audible? I just want to make sure.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. The telemetry errors, I think in my previous presentations also pointed out that the telemetry errors and the C solution related metrics, in these, the anomalies that are being tracked are at a historical low level. We are planning to replace them for the next year. We are in a very advanced stage. One of the important considerations is that in the past several years, we have taken benefit of tracking these metrics for improving the issues related to telemetry. and also the model, any modeling issues. But main focus that is always helps during initial stages. And once there's a stabilized, and it's almost over, it's over 8 years. In the last 8 years, we have seen that the measurements have increased fourfold. Anomalies are historically low. Right now, we are around 300 for 60,000, 70,000 range measurements. But that's it's we are looking at line flow measurements and then the estimates as a comparison, which means the residues of line flows are the metrics that we are looking at for the next year. So for this year, still, since these are still there as part of the metrics, we are tracking and providing those details. Next slide, please. And among these metrics, MVR also, you can see that not too different. However, in reality, the MVR solution is relatively, from a quality perspective, relatively less in terms of overall solution quality. But however, it's not apparent from these. So that's another reason that we would say that the line flow based metric would truly reflect how the SC is performing and how the SC solution quality looks like. Next slide, please. Here's another metric that's has been very low for 8,500 contingencies that we studied. The diverse contingencies are very, very few. In terms of number, which might provide better feel because the numbers are very low. So typically in the range of about 3 to 5. We are looking at possibility of if those specific contingencies can be shown, so that we can go after those contingencies, specific contingencies, why they're happening, and also rule out any possibilities of or categorize them into whether it's due to data errors, or is it a modeling error or software error, or possibly it's genuinely an issue pointing to voltage stability. So this could help if we track the actual contingency. So that's kind of improvement we're planning for the future. Though it's not sure whether it can happen immediately in the next year, but we are in the track. Again, we can see that the diverse contingencies are at a very, very low as well now. Can you go to the next slide, please? I think that's about it. Yeah, that's what and I'll hand it back to Rachel. If you have any questions, I can take up now or even later. I'll still be in a meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Vera. Thanks, appreciate it. So we'll move on to the next metric here on DACA, or day ahead contingency analysis accuracy. So we observed some improvement in Q3 compared to the rest of the year. We believe this may be contributed by the day ahead engineers adjusting the load distribution factors, making more accurate OPA cases. We also saw less violations observed during this time period in our TCA. So this may be some of the contributions why we're seeing some increased improvement here through Q3, and we'll see the rest of the year. On the next slide. The last metric we'll report out today in the public presentation is regarding our city or our customer inquiry and dispute information ticket resolution progress. This varies month to month, and we're seeing the trends on the number of cases that are opened and closed in a given month, peaking, in the summer months and then going down in September. And the trend here showing average business days with crisis support as well as average business days to close fluctuating. And that's the last slide I believe we have on the metrics. So I don't see any comments in the chat, but feel free to raise your hand if you have a question or let us know if you have any feedback.
Thank you, Rachel and Vera. So I don't see any questions in chat. Silas, do we have anyone on the phone for questions?
There are no questions on the phone line at this time.
Thank you. So working group updates, I think, Rachel, we're going to hand it back to you again for the next few slides.
Okay, thanks, Brenda. So for data exchange working group, as Kathy mentioned, we do have some updates to the data specification. On the next slide here, we'll talk through those changes. So the first one is ERC 120, or the guidelines for the data specification. So we've reviewed the comments with Data Exchange Working Group and had a commenting period to get some feedback, which we've responded to all in RC Portal. We updated the references for the new NERC standard coming into effect in April and added a data request for coverage of those new requirements. And then for the data specification itself, we've added a data request with discussions with the Data Exchange Working Group and the Cold Weather Task Force regarding the minimum design operating temperature. We've done some cleanup as well with the annual review and added some data requests for items that were previously communicated in RC 130 just for some cleanup, and then changed the exceptions to the data request after working with some entities and cleaning that up. And then on the next slide, we also have some updates to modeling templates. So with that minimum design operating temperature, we created the extreme weather template for entities to be able to provide us this information with the modeling process, as well as a list of BES exceptions. That's another process that was previously in RC Portal, and just streamlining it through RIMS and making those updates to the modeling templates. And then we also have the RAS ICCP template, did some cleanup there based on some feedback that we've received and working through this template with entities for some time. And then the user guide and submission checklist, making those clarifications and cleanups so we're consistent about the templates that are out there and what supporting documents we have out there. And that's what we have for data exchange. On the next slide, I believe I'll turn it over to Mike Turner for his update on the full network model process enhancement.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. This is Mike Turner, Senior Manager of Model and Contract Implementation and the full network model process. I've got about 9 slides here to talk about an enhancement of that process. Each year, we publish a schedule for our full network models. It's published in the spring of each year for the following year. So, for example, the spring of this year, we published the schedule for the year 2023. The idea is to give participants enough information far enough in advance to plan their model submissions. And that schedule includes not only a submission document submission deadline, but when we expect to publish the final scope of each full network model, when we target to put it into production, as well as the recommended earliest project implementation date on it. Next slide. One of the challenges that we've been experiencing are a large number of late model scope changes that are submitted, both from internal and external sources. For some numbers, just to understand the scope of this, in 2021, out of the 8 model builds we had a total of 234 items, or an average of 29 per model build. Now, I recognize those are line items, So, one incorporation of a SIM model could certainly incorporate a number of line items, but it's still a large amount. In 2022, just taking the information from 7 out of the 8 model builds, I did not incorporate the data from the very last one we did here in November, but there were 403 line items, or about an average of 57. Again, this number appears to be increasing. Next slide. So there are some concerns certainly with late model scope changes. First, it takes time to submit, evaluate, document, and ultimately incorporate into the final model build each one. It creates a risk to our development and testing of each full network model to try to meet that published schedule. RC West entities, rely on timely deployments, and any delays to the deployment can impact both generation and transmission projects, but can also have fiscal and reliability impacts as well. Next slide. In addition, there's a lack of externally published guidelines on the late model scope changes, and it's unclear if upper level management is aware of late submissions or efforts to address their root causes. Here at the California ISO, we've worked and continue to work to identify and address root causes for internally sourced late model scope changes, but there's the potential opportunity for upper level management in all organizations that are either submitting or impacted by late model scope changes to understand what their root causes are and look at process improvements to try to mitigate those. Next slide, please. So what we've got here is what we've put together as a process. In essence, it works for both internally sourced and externally sourced late model scope changes, where a form would be submitted, and I'll show that form here in the upcoming slide. It would require a signature, and I'll go through the external side here, from the entity's VP, whoever's submitting that request for a late model scope change. It would be submitted to our full network model at CAISO.com mailbox. We're looking for that at least 7 calendar days before the creation of version A of our full network model build. I'll explain that more here in a second. Internally, we'll look at that to evaluate the impact of the request for model change. If there's a schedule change to version A required in order to incorporate that, we would then escalate that. If there's not, and there's no change to that version A, we would go ahead and submit that into DocuSign for formal approval. If there is an impact to it, those internal teams will identify the new schedule and the impacts to generation or transmission projects that may be a result of the delay in that version A. That request will go to grid operations in our organization for an evaluation of the critical need and potential for escalation. If there's no critical need or a potential for escalation of this late model scope change, the recommendation will be to not incorporate it in that pending full network model, but actually move it to the following next network model scope, and we would notify the requester. If there is a critical need for the late model scope change, we would submit that into DocuSign for a request for the Vice President of Operations to consider. If it is approved, you can see it moves over to update our current scope and notify the requester, and it may not be approved, in which case we would look to move it to the next model. That's the process at a high level. It also works on the internal side, where internally, if we identify a need to add something to the scope, it would require a director level approval and go through the exact same process. We'd still be looking at that 7 calendar days in advance of version A and apply the same criteria to it that we would for an external source. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that we've gotten and we wanted to be clear on is that, what are those considerations that the Vice President of Operations would consider when it came to approving or not approving a late model scope change request that potentially had a critical need or a potential for escalation. Well, one, what exactly are the impacts to the grid? What are the number of days of delay? Are we talking 1 day or a week? What other impacted parties would be involved in this delay? What projects would be impacted? Are there application upgrades that we're looking to do? Are there market simulations in progress? Is there a stakeholder initiative about to be implemented? What escalation could it get? Could it be escalated to the CEO of our organization, a state governor, or a state congressional representative? These are just some of the considerations that our vice president will need to take into consideration in making that decision. Next slide, please. So we wanted to standardize a form. This is a model of that form. It has the directions at the top of the completion of it and submission of it, information that we're looking for, and some drop downs that would include, what is the purpose of the late model scope change? Is it to fix a prior modeling documentation submission error? Is it a late submission of modeling documentation overall? Or are we moving an implementation date? Obviously, we have an other as well, just in case we've got something that maybe doesn't fit one of those three categories, and an area on it in free-form text for people to provide an explanation for what the critical need is to be included in the particular scope they're asking for here. And also we have an option to remove things as well. Not sure what that would be, but we wanted to make sure that the form was inclusive. This form would be submitted and would be evaluated. The submission 7 calendar days in advance of version A, next slide please, ties to this schedule. I talked about it at the beginning of the presentation here, and I've done a mock-up here for our 2022 schedule, where we would include that scheduled date for version A. As you can see, it's roughly about 3 weeks prior to when we're scheduling to deploy the model into production. And those 3 weeks are used to do testing in our in 2 separate environments, complete all that testing, make sure there are no issues, maybe remedy some issues. It might require a version B in that case, but that 3 weeks is a tight timeline as it is, and that's what the issue is with the late model scope changes we're receiving. So we're hoping that by implementing this kind of a process, we gain that greater visibility to upper level management, both internally and externally, to late model scope changes and their root causes. We would also be documenting this in our BPM for the full network model. So we've got the concern about external guidelines not being available. It'd be published in that BPM for people's reference. Next slide. This is where we're at this point. I've explained this to our executives back at the end of September, presented this to the Data Exchange Working Group in the middle of November, and I'm now presenting it to the RC West Oversight Committee. We're looking to gather feedback sent to us by the full network, to the full network model at kaiso.com mailbox by the 12th of December. We'll evaluate that feedback and see if there's any need for any changes to what we've put together here. We've done many iterations of this, and we think we've got a pretty good process here that is fair and equitable to all and puts in place the right process for incorporation of late model scope changes. Once we incorporate those, we would start the PRR process to include that documentation in our BPM for full network model. When that PRR process is completed, we'd be publishing that updated full network model schedule to include the version A target date for 2023 for people's reference and begin the process. So that's the presentation that I've got. I'm open now for any questions that people may have.
Thank you, Mike. I don't see any questions in chat. Stylist, do you have any questions from your end?
No questions on the phone line at this time.
Okay, well, I'll just remind everyone that if you do have any feedback, please send it to us. You can send it to me, Mike Turner, at the full network model at kaiso.com mailbox, and I'll be happy to receive that. Okay, Brenda, I think that's what we've got.
Thank you. So next we do have Tricia Johnson for the next slides.
Yes, so thank you, Brenda. So for FERC 881, I'll say I've also got Raja here to help answer any questions and backup, but we thought it would be good to share with the Oversight Committee what our plans are for proceeding around, with stakeholder processes around FERC 881. We've been receiving a lot of questions. Everyone's aware that it's a very large uplift and a long time frame, and we're anxious to get going on it here shortly. So please go to the next slide, Brenda. So for everyone's awareness, if you haven't, been into the detail on FERC 881 yet, it requires ambient adjusted ratings to be used in evaluation or curtailment of near-term transmission service. So that 10 days or less time frame, there is a lot of activity that is happening in different processes in that 10-day time frame. And so the ISO team that's been looking at this has kind of been looking at those potential impacts for, what do we do now, and how would that adjust and kind of stay within the timelines of our current processes. And so what we expect is that, the additional data that would be coming in that time frame would be used as part of the congestion management processes in the markets. And then for the entities who are not participating in the KISO markets or in the WEIM, we would still be taking in that data, and we would be considering it for use as part of our OPA type studies and things like that. So we did have a compliance filing earlier this year at FERC to just basically provide kind of our high-level approach, but the compliance deadline for full implementation of FERC 881 is by July 12th of 2025. Next slide, please. So our internal project team, as I'd mentioned, we've kind of been scoping out like how do we, kind of take small bites of this to start working our way through it, and we will be initiating a public stakeholder process. So we did actually have a public stakeholder meeting just prior to that FERC filing to, kind of raise awareness and receive input, and we've actually presented at the Data Exchange Working Group meeting a short while ago, and got some feedback from them as well that they would like to have more in-depth discussions about this. The public stakeholder process for KISO is we're looking at both kind of our KISO BA, our WEIM, as well as for RC West. So it's a very comprehensive kind of broad stakeholder audience. But the RC Data Exchange Working Group gave us feedback that they would also like the opportunity to potentially have small group breakout discussions. So I think as we hit different topics kind of for the different process areas, then we can always pull things out of that stakeholder process and then have additional discussions as needed. The three tracks that we're proposing is track one. It would be focused on real-time reliability applications, and this is really receiving the dynamic line ratings and ambient adjusted ratings via ICCP into our EMS system and into the real-time monitoring and study applications. We actually are started on that already. Part of our holdup is we have some software changes that need to happen in order to finish that early work, but then a lot of the implementation around this will be coming up with the implementation timeframes for all of you. So based on when your companies are ready to start providing that data, then we would start queuing it up accordingly to get those additional points into the model process and setup and testing and things like that. So that a lot of the uplift on that will be the actual data implementation, because we're already exchanging data via ICCP. For track 2, which we believe we need to start in parallel with track 1, we'll be looking really at more our foundational applications, where we're storing the ratings in the static model data, and how we need to expand the structure of what we currently house in those ratings, and the timeframes where those ratings get updated, and those would really be the kind of the backstop seasonal type ratings that would be used if we didn't receive a rating, let's say via ICCP, you know, in a real-time time frame. So that we look to be starting in parallel. That one will be a little bit larger of an architecture change for CAISO, and so we don't want to run these in serial. We think starting them in parallel is really important. The third one will probably be the largest change for all of you, given especially if you're participating in the markets and things like that, given that we would be initiating some transfer of data in additional timeframes that you're not used to working with us on today. You know, your transmission side processes for rating submission aren't generally sending us things in 10 days out, 7 days out, or closer in, unless it's in context of the outage study process. So this one also, we're looking at, you know, what are the existing processes and timeframes? How do we bring this data in without impacting those timeframes, and really kind of firm up our decisions on which data will be used for decision making where. And that one we would target for implementation out in 2025. Next slide, please. So to give just a little bit more detail, as I'd mentioned, track 1, you know, probably the most common question we've received from your companies so far had been, you know, which data would be via ICCP versus other methods. And so we see that really track 1 is the only one that would be via ICCP. The model data and the market application data would be via other means. So the model data today for the entities who are in the CAISO BA area, we have a transmission register. And so, you know, one of the things we've talked about is expanding our transmission register structure to accommodate a different rating types. And then we've also explored whether we would want to bring all the ratings in from non-CAISO BA customers into that same structure, or if we would be building a new database structure. But we would, you know, have an interface, like user interface, way to do file upload, you know, things like that, bringing things in using, you know, kind of our model timeframe type submissions. But we also know that we need to provide this data and this database to all of you for access as well. So it wouldn't just be the one way in and then going and looking at the exported files on RC Portal. That what we're envisioning is that you would have an interface or something where you could not only view the ratings that you've submitted to CAISO and RC West, but also be able to view the ratings for your neighbors that you would also need to be accessing. And then the track 3, as I said, we're kind of looking at our existing timeframes around our market processes, as well as some of the look-ahead processes. And we're anticipating, you know, multiple external system impacts, but from an interface standpoint, looking at probably, you know, some new APIs or new user interfaces, depending on what we need to do kind of application architecture-wise. So this is the one space where we from an external interface standpoint, potentially don't have that current UI in place, like that could just be modified. It probably would be something new. So I know that was a lot of information at a really, really high level, and we're going to have the stakeholder meeting on this, where we'll go, you know, probably one layer down in detail. I think coming up on the 21st of December, but I would, you know, welcome any questions at this point, if anyone has any questions or concerns about this approach. I do see it looks like there's a question in chat. Oh, but that was from Mike Turner. So.
Yeah, so Tricia, there's no questions, but just to confirm, the stakeholder call will be next in 2 weeks, not next week, but the 21st of December.
Oh, you're right,
So
the 21st. Yes.
Yeah, just to confirm, it got moved.
Yes. We moved it out a week. You're right.
Yeah, so just want to make sure that's good. But other than that, there aren't any questions for Tricia. Feel free to raise your hand or submit through chat.
Okay, and if you have any questions after, feel free to reach out to Raja, and I think we foresee that as part of the stakeholder process, we'll have documents that I think they're talking about writing a white paper from kind of the network applications and engineering side. We will have a kind of data specification type things, timeframes, things like that we would, work with the stakeholders to make sure we're on the same page, publish things, and have commenting. But I know everyone's anxious to get moving with this, so we definitely appreciate your companies participating and helping us pull this together. So thank you.
Thank you, Tricia. So at this time, we are wrapping up our meeting. The last item we have is our future agenda items that we want to share with you. This calendar will be available possibly within the next coming weeks of the calendar of all working groups and the RC Oversight Committee. I prepared this for the team so that way we can know what's going on. So we're going to have our next RC Oversight Committee on February 23rd in green, and it's going to be quarterly. So if you follow the green icon, it'll show up on the 23rd, May 25th, August 24th, and then December 7th. Most of these dates can be subject to change. We made sure to accommodate with any major meetings happening within other companies, so we were cautious of planning these dates at a good time for everyone. But at this time, I want to make sure we could bring back Ben for any closing remarks for our call today. I think, Ben, you're on mute, but that's okay. But if there's any public comments, feel free to raise your hand so we can unmute you. Okay, so I wanted to see, Ben, can we confirm audio with you just before we wrap up the public session for today's call?
Yes, and I was on mute. Sorry about that.
Okay. So we have no more questions. We do want to let you know that we do have the executive session right away after this call. Please be sure to join that meeting. For those who are participating for the executive session, just double checking any messages here. No more messages for me, but great. So this presentation will be available on the RC website as a PDF. And so that could be on there under 2022 meetings. We'll make sure, if you do want the presentation, we'll make sure to send that out, but that's already available on the RC portal. But other than that, we can go ahead and close this call and head towards the executive session at a separate meeting for those that were invited. And then also, if you do want to, just quickly for attendance, if you didn't submit their chat, we will be able to capture it after the meeting, but just if you could submit it right now, that'll be great. But other than that, we could close this meeting in a moment or two. So yeah, if no one has any questions, great. All right, Silas, let's go ahead and back to you to close this call for us today.
That concludes today's conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.